Welcome to this press conference. Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. I'm with CBC News. With us today, aujourd'hui, on a le ministre.
With us today, we have David Lametti.
His Parliamentary Secretary Gary Anandasangari, and I apologize if I've just mispronounced that. And they will be talking to us about the new projet de loi that was introduced in the House. Mr. Minister.
Bonjour. Hello. Thank you for being here. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to thank my colleague here on the stage with me today, Gary Anandasangari, who was just named as my new parliamentary secretary. Thank you for being here, Gary, as indeed you were here back in February. I also want to take this occasion to thank Arif Irani, my former parliamentary secretary, with whom I worked closely since my original nomination as a minister, as well as Bardish Chagger, who played an important role in moving forward the former Bill C-22.
During the last campaign, our party promised Canadians that if we were re-elected, we would reintroduce these essential reforms to the criminal code and to reforming the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. We are keeping that promise. With Bill C-5, we are turning the page on the policy of the former government. It is a policy that, in the end, did not discourage crime or make our justice system more efficient or more fair. All the approach did was imprison too many Indigenous, Black, and marginalized Canadians.
When it comes to conservative justice policy, the facts speak loudly and clearly. It simply did not work. The best evidence, sadly, is in our prison populations. Indigenous adults represent 5% of the general population, but account for 30% of federally incarcerated inmates. That's double what it was 20 years ago. And it's even higher in certain provinces. Black inmates represent 7.2% of the federal offender population, but only 3% of the Canadian population. These statistics, this record is shameful. The reason the numbers are so high is due in good part to current sentencing laws which focus on punishment through imprisonment. At the center of this approach is the mandatory minimum policy. This rigid, one-size-fits-all approach makes it impossible for judges to take into account mitigating factors and to impose a sentence that fits the crime. And I'm not talking about hardened criminals here. I'm talking about low-risk, first-time or non-violent offenders. Think about your own kids. Perhaps they got into trouble at some point with the law. I bet you would want to give them the benefit of the doubt or a second chance if they messed up. Well, it is a lot harder to get a second chance the way things are now. And that's particularly true if you are a young person who happens to be Indigenous or Black. Our criminal law is full of examples of what happens with mandatory minimums. Here's one. A young man with a promising career, living in an isolated community with no criminal record, has a job, an apprenticeship, has the beginning of a relationship, and he's out drinking on a Saturday night with his friends. That night, he makes a bad decision that changes his life. On a dare, he fires a hunting rifle in the direction of an empty building. No one gets hurt. Neighbors call the police. He is charged and convicted with discharging a firearm while reckless. Because of the minimum mandatory penalty, he receives 4 years in prison. The young man loses his apprenticeship and his relationship. And once out of prison, his opportunities are limited, and he ends up moving in with the people he met in prison. 4 years in jail was finishing school for this young man in the wrong direction, and this young man previously had so much to offer. This has to stop. Canadians understand the injustice in examples such as this one. They see mental illness, they see problematic addiction, and they see poverty as being criminalized. They see, as we do, that democracies around the world are moving away from this approach to criminal justice. Even rock-solid conservatives in the United States see MMPs as a failed policy that actually encourages cycles of crime and violence and that leaves our communities less safe. It is in this context that we have reintroduced legislation to amend the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Bill C-5 is an important step towards a safer society. It will help our justice system become fairer and more effective, and it shows that our government is committed to building a more equitable and inclusive Canada for everyone. The legislation introduced proposes a number of measures to reform sentencing. First, with respect to minimum mandatory penalties, we propose to repeal MMPs of imprisonment for all drug offences and certain firearm offences. These specific penalties have been shown to contribute to the over-incarceration of Indigenous people, Black people, and marginalized Canadians. By repealing these MMPs, we will restore a judge's ability to impose an appropriate sentence that responds to the facts of the case before them. This moves away from the one-size-fits-all approach which MMPs impose. To be clear, we're keeping some MMPs in place for murder, sexual offenses, including child sexual offenses, impaired driving offenses, and serious firearm offenses, including firearms offenses connected to organized crime. Je veux être clair.
I want to be clear. Repealing mandatory minimum penalties does not limit the power of judges. They will still be able to impose long sentences if they believe they are necessary. Serious crimes will and must be punished. We are simply giving back to judges the possibility of imposing sentences that reflect the crime.
The bill is to restore access to conditional sentence orders, or CSOs, by removing arbitrary restrictions imposed by previous Conservative governments. A CSO is a sentence of incarceration of less than 2 years that may be served in the community under strict conditions if a judge is satisfied that doing so would pose, and I underline, no risk to society, no risk to public safety. Bill C-5 would allow CSOs in cases where a judge determines that the appropriate sentence would be less than 2 years and the offender does not pose a threat. Judges would have the option to order that the term be served in the community under strict conditions, including house arrest and curfew. This measure will allow for more effective rehabilitation and reintegration by allowing individuals to keep their job, to care for their children or family members, or to seek counseling or treatment for substance abuse and addictions abuse. This measure has proven to reduce the likelihood of someone reoffending. These two Conservative practices, mandatory minimum penalties and restrictions on CSOs, have prevented courts from exploring effective approaches to sentencing, such as restorative justice and other alternatives to imprisonment. And they reduce the impact of pre-sentencing Gladue reports. We want to change that. This bill also reinforces our government's commitment to addressing the opioid crisis and those impacted by this tragedy. C-5 will require police and prosecutors to consider alternative measures for simple drug possession offenses, such as diversion to addiction treatment programs, rather than laying criminal charges or prosecuting people. This can help individuals dealing with addictions to get the treatment they need and avoid falling into a cycle of criminality. We propose to provide police and prosecutors with the tools and guidance they need to treat addiction as a health issue, not as a criminal one. Cette approche n'a pas seulement une énorme
This approach not only has great potential, but also corresponds to what experts in public health and the law have told us. We know that the criminal justice system is a terrible teacher. Appropriate dejudicialization of crimes is the right direction to take. First of all, we can reduce overrepresentation of certain populations in the prison system, including people who suffer from mental health or addiction. We can also reduce the burden on our courts and make them more efficient. But simply reforming criminal justice is not enough. In order for things to work, we need to provide appropriate services. Our government is investing to support those who need help.
We announced $50 million to support the implementation of GLADU principles in the justice system, and funding that would support the expansion of impact of race and cultural assessments, IRCAs, across Canada. These assessments allow sentencing judges to consider the disadvantages and systemic racism that contribute to racialized Canadians' interactions with the criminal justice system. We also announced almost $29 million to support community justice centre pilot projects in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Ontario, as well as consultations to expand community justice centres across the country. We are also developing an Indigenous justice strategy in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. We have also announced our intention to develop a Black Canadians justice strategy. And we will continue to address the social determinants of crime. Every action we take to improve access to housing, mental health care, addictions treatment, and youth employment helps build a safer and stronger Canada. For example, the Youth Justice Fund provides funding to programs to target youth involved in our criminal justice system or those that work with these youth, with a particular focus on projects that address systemic racism. This package is a substantial and necessary reset for our criminal law. It will be critical to addressing systemic racism and discrimination in the justice system, and it will move us past failed conservative policies which have made us less safe. La réforme que nous présentons aujourd'hui,
the reform that we are presenting today and all of our government's efforts are an important step forward. Thank you.
Take your questions.
Time for questions. For those in the room, there are microphones on either side. And if you can please identify yourself and your media. And this is the first time I've done this for a while, so be gentle.
You're doing great, Liz. David Thurton, CBC News. So when the Harper government came to power, they added about 50 mandatory minimums. Your legislation that you're introducing, Minister Lametti, repeals about 20 of those 50 minimums. Why not go further? If you are criticizing the Harper government's approach to justice, why are you still keeping their approach to justice still on the books?
Thank you for that question, David. This is an important step. I believe that I'm the first justice minister in recent memory, perhaps longer than recent memory, to repeal any minimum mandatory sentences, and we're repealing about 20. This is an important step, and it's an important step particularly targeting offenses that lead to overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other marginalized Canadians in the criminal justice system. So it's an important step. I'm not saying it's the only step. We're also investing in other areas of the criminal justice system, and we will continue to watch all of the other various penalties to see the impact that this particular legislative proposal will have.
I understand that it is a step, but you're criticizing the Harper government's justice policies. But still, a lot of their policies, a lot of those mandatory minimums remain on the books. I mean, you have influential people who have criticized your approach. I mean, you had Senator Kim Pate, who says that your last legislation, which is the same as basically this one, stopped short of taking the kinds of bold steps that are needed. And people are saying that, you know, your legislation is very negligible, that people will still, Black and Indigenous Canadians, will still be sentenced and still end up in jail. So why not go further? Why not be a bit more bold and ambitious?
Look, I disagree with the characterization that this isn't an important step. It's an important step. It's a bold step. Tell me another justice minister who's repealed minimum mandatory penalties. The conditional sentence orders is critically important. It is possible that the restrictions on conditional sentence orders by the Harper government, they were brought in by a Liberal government prior to that, it's possible that the restrictions on the conditional sentence orders by the Harper government was an even more regressive step than imposing minimum mandatory penalties. Let's not forget those. They are an important part of the picture that make all sorts of other sentencing possibilities possible, particularly restorative justice and other rehabilitative programs. So look at the ensemble. I believe this is a very bold step, and I believe it's an important step moving forward. And most importantly, it changes the direction of past policy.
Micro à gauche.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Lametti.
Hello. Laurence Martin, Radio-Canada. In another file, compensation for Indigenous children who were taken from their home, you said that you were hoping there would be an agreement by December. What is happening in that negotiation? Can we expect something by December? Obviously, I cannot talk publicly about the negotiations. The discussions are still taking place. I will say what I said at the beginning. For the same reasons, I remain optimistic. Question: do you think there will be an agreement reached this week? Answer: as I said, I can't even give any hint. It's a complex issue. There are several parties. As we said from the beginning, we want a comprehensive agreement, which represents a lot of work. So I can't really comment on that. Question inaudible. Answer: that is what we said. We wanted to have an agreement before the end of the year. I cannot comment further. Thank you.
My right.
Erica Ibrahim, the Canadian Press. Minister, when the last bill was introduced, you were reported to have said that decriminalization of simple possession of illicit drugs, movement on that front, it wasn't your place to go further. Advocates have been calling for decriminalization, and even Minister Bennett is reportedly open to this option to avoid unduly harming those suffering from substance use. What is your position now?
Well, it's the same position in the sense that this is a criminal sentencing bill, and we are introducing a measure of diversion in order to avoid that kind of sentencing. So part of this bill includes a discretion on the part of police officers and prosecutors to divert people charged with simple possession offenses out of the criminal justice system to more appropriate forms of help. That's entirely consistent with what Minister Bennett has said, with what Minister Hajdu said before her. And so there obviously are requests that have been made, for example, using Section 56 of the powers of the health minister. And this kind of treating drug offenses as a health question, treating problematic addiction as a health question and not as a criminal justice question, is entirely on all fours with all of this. And I'll leave it to Minister Bennett and our government as a whole to look at those requests with the care and attention that they need.
Minister Lametti, Mike Lucatore with Global National. I wanted to ask you specifically on the mandatory minimums. Is there any model around the world that you are looking to now and trying to match, or is this simply just going back and sort of repealing what the Conservatives did? Like, how do you see this matching up with other models around the world?
Thank you for the question. As I alluded to in my comments, there is an increasing understanding that mandatory minimums don't work. Even hardcore Conservatives in the United States are beginning to look at and revise minimum mandatory penalties. That's already happening in the United States, particularly at a variety of different state levels. It is a general, I think there's a general understanding that all MMPs do is increase the number of people you put in prison. It doesn't reduce crime, doesn't reduce recidivism, and has a negative impact on your ability to treat problems in the way they should be treated. Maybe a health problem, maybe there may be other social determinants.
On that front, though, you were talking about how understanding that addiction is a health issue, not a criminal one. You said you'll leave it to Minister Bennett, but by the same token, when talking about, answering one of my colleagues' questions on small possession, how much further are you ready to go here in terms of making sure that the justice system is set up in such a way that it does not penalize people who have addictions, that we are looking at this as a holistic approach, as opposed to just saying for now, I'll wait till Minister Bennett has a plan and then we'll have a plan. Is there something that you're trying to sort of prepare the soil for here?
When I was referring to Minister Bennett, I was referring to her powers under Section 56 of that Act. Look, as a government, we will always look at any challenge, I suppose, from the perspective of evidence, from the perspective of best practices, and so I have said quite often on a number of different fronts that I'm never averse to a positive suggestion or solution, and I'm always willing to assess that. Obviously, as a government, we'll continue to assess our options on a variety of different fronts, working with experts across a variety of different domains and working collectively as a team. We know that the opioid crisis is serious. We know that it's a serious health problem, and we will work as a team to resolve those issues. As Minister Bennett has said publicly, we'll use every tool at our disposal in order to address that problem.
Small possession as well could be, you're open to changing that?
Well, we're changing it in this piece of legislation with respect to giving police officers and prosecutors the discretion to divert those people from the criminal justice system into more appropriate forms to address those problems. That's a critical first step that falls within the larger ambit of sentencing in the criminal justice system. It reinforces measures that have already been taken by the prosecution service, the federal prosecution service in Canada, responds to call that a number of stakeholders, experts, and police bodies across Canada have asked for. And we will support those efforts. So this is an important step already in this piece of legislation. And as Minister Bennett said, we'll look at all the other tools that are available at our disposal.
Okay. We've got one more in the room, David Thurton, CBC News, and then we'll go to the phones and the operator.
So you mentioned something about a Black justice strategy in your opening comments, Minister. Is that new? Is that something new that you're embarking on in your new mandate? And if so, can you talk about some of the next steps that you're going to be taking? Who are you going to be talking to? How soon could we see this justice strategy being developed? I mean, out there.
Thank you for that question. And at the end of my answer, I'm going to turn it over to my parliamentary secretary, Gary Ananda-Sangri, who invited me to his riding back in 2019 to do a roundtable with stakeholders from the Black community to discuss precisely these kinds of ideas. I won't speak about my mandate letter because I don't have it yet, but this is the idea of developing a Black justice strategy was something that began to be talked about publicly prior to the election. So obviously we're comfortable saying that this is something that's on my radar screen. It is something that we will develop with stakeholders in order to get better outcomes, more just outcomes, working with community leadership across Canada. They're very different communities, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, other parts of the country, and so we will be working closely with them, and one of those leaders is precisely my parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Minister. And to add to that, our government recognized the existence of anti-Black racism across Canada on a number of different fronts. The members of the Black community are impacted deeply within the justice system. I know in the community that I represent, there is a disproportionate impact, not just through incarceration, but afterwards when young people are applying for jobs, when they're applying for apartments, for all aspects of their life, they're directly impacted. So it is very important that I think we engage with stakeholders. We have a distinctions-based approach that looks at the impact of the justice system on members of the Black community. Again, based on the different circumstances in different communities across Canada. But it is important, as we laid out in the speech from the throne and even previously, the existence of the anti-Black racism and the need to address it in a way that will have a direct impact on the community, both in terms of breaking down some of the barriers that exist. So when we did the Black entrepreneurship strategy, for example, last year, it's to ensure that the barriers that exist to issues such as credit is enhanced, but at the same time to break down the impediments that we've seen over the years, whether it's through the child welfare system or through the criminal justice system, where members of the Black community are disproportionately impacted.
David, can I just add to what I mentioned in the speech, the impact of race and culture assessments pilot project, IRCAs. You may know about GLADU reports in the context of sentencing of Indigenous offenders. The IRCAs are there for Black offenders, and it is something that the community came to us to develop. And so we've put money into those pilot projects in order that a sentencing judge would have a greater degree of background, if you will, particularly race-related background that might influence how a person ought to be sentenced. These are important steps, and the development of a Black justice strategy will take it further.
So can I follow up by asking, when do you expect this strategy to be out there and finalized? And just what is the scope of this strategy? Will it take into regard the RCMP, Canada Border Services, Canada's corrections services, even the military? Because when you talk about the justice system, it has a lot of tentacles. So can you just maybe talk about when we might see it, or what is the best optimist? Like, how much time are you giving yourself to develop this strategy, and what will be the scope of it?
Well, obviously, I can't answer those precise questions just yet until we see the mandate letters. But it is fair to say that there will be community consultation. We'll be working with community leadership across Canada. That will affect both the scope and the actual provisions that or recommendations that come out of that strategy. I can also say that I work with my ministerial colleagues and my caucus colleagues. So whether a number of these issues, as you quite rightly point out, will touch on the Minister of Public Safety, will touch on the Minister of National Defence, and I can assure you that we will work together in a variety of different areas in order to effect change.
Just before we go to the phones, if I can throw one question in. Minister, do you know when you're going to get your mandate letter?
I wish I did. I'm hoping it's soon.
Okay. Operator, if we can go to the phones, and if it's possible, can we give preference to members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery and then other reporters?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question is from Jacques Galland, Toronto Star. La première question de Jacques Galland, Toronto Star. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Hi, Minister. My first question is, why is it that you're tabling the exact same bill as C-22? We saw with conversion therapy that died in the last Parliament, you brought back a stronger bill. I'm wondering, why didn't you take the opportunity this time as well with this bill to bring back a different bill that might have incorporated some of what advocates and experts have been calling for in terms of decriminalization or in terms of repealing more MMPs? Why not bring back a different bill?
Thank you, Jacques, for the question. I'll be perfectly honest with you. In both cases, the answer is what we promised in our platform in the election. But there's also a reason why those platforms were different. With respect to conversion therapy, the bill got much further along last time, and because of those committee hearings and the better information that we got as a result of that process, we could go further. This particular bill the minimum mandatories bill didn't get us far. We promised the same bill. We promised to do it quickly, and we're fulfilling that promise. Obviously, there's a parliamentary process now, and we'll see where that leads us.
Thanks. And then my follow-up is on the issue of not repealing more mandatory minimums. I'm wondering, can you explain why is it that the government trusts judges to impose fit sentences in certain offenses where you're proposing to repeal MMPs, but doesn't trust judges to impose fit sentences in other offenses where you're keeping MMPs and therefore judges' hands remain tied at sentencing?
Look, yeah, I think it's fair to say that as Minister of Justice, I have a great deal of faith in the judiciary to interpret and follow laws that Parliament promulgates. I have a great deal of respect for the judiciary. You know my background, Jacques. I clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and that had a monumental impact on my life. This is an important step today. We're beginning to reverse in Canada a series of policies, both with respect to minimum mandatories, and once again, as I said to your colleague, we need to think about conditional sentencing orders as well as a major part of this bill and as a major piece of reform, bringing back the possibility of CSOs in most cases. This is an important step. We're turning the ship around, and I can say that I'm comfortable that this is an important step. I am, as I had said, the first Justice Minister in recent memory to reverse the position on minimum mandatory penalties. There tends to be an addition of minimum mandatories in the other direction over time. We're reversing that, and I think this is an important step.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. There are no further questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment. I would now like to turn the meeting back over to the room. J'aimerais maintenant retourner la parole dans la salle. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, and thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Merci. The conference has now ended. La conférence est maintenant terminée.